Okay, well, I'm really pleased to join you today at school, and I want to start by saying that I'm about to celebrate my 67th birthday and my 52nd year of human rights campaigning. Now, this to me seems totally implausible because nothing in my background inclined or prepared me for a lifetime of LGBT and other human rights activism. I want to give you the message today that if I can, from my beginnings, make a difference, then so can you. So I want you to take inspiration from my work and apply it to your own life. Because if you decide you want to do something, you can achieve a lot. There is no limit. So think about that during this talk. I was born in Melbourne, Australia in 1952, and I grew up in a period of very illiberal conservative government. There were anti-communist witch hunts. Anybody who expressed liberal or progressive opinions got denounced as a communist. And I nearly lost my job, my first job, because I opposed Australia's involvement in the war in Vietnam. My parents were ultra-conservative Christians, very similar to those depicted in Jeanette Winterson's book, Oranges Are Not the Only Fruit. If you haven't read it, I really recommend it. It's a fantastic book. But she captures what her parents were like, and my parents were almost exactly the same. On the positive side, my parents taught me to stand up for what is right. They always used to say, don't follow the crowd, do what's right. Don't follow the fashion, do what you believe is the right thing to do. And that's something I imbibed and still believe in. I don't claim for one moment that I'm always right. All that I can claim is that I follow my conscience. My father worked in an engineering factory. He was a factory worker. He operated a big lathe machine. My mother alternated between being a housewife and working in the local biscuit factory. She had bouts of sometimes life-threatening asthma, where she nearly died on many, many occasions during my childhood. And in those days in Australia, there was no National Health Service. You had to go to the doctors, you had to pay. You had to go to the hospital, you had to pay. You had to get medicine, you had to pay. So we were really dirt poor because so much of our family income went on medical bills. I guess that hardship probably honed my passion for justice. I can remember thinking to myself as a young boy how unfair it was that just because our mother was so seriously ill that we should suffer so much financial hardship. I can remember coming in from school and after playing sport or something being really hungry and going to the cupboards and there being nothing there. Life was really, really tough. From the age of 8, whenever my mother was seriously ill, I had to run the house. So I had to look after my younger brother and 2 sisters. I had to do the washing, the cleaning, the cooking, get them ready for school, all those kind of things, as well as going to school myself. Initially, of course, I made a complete hash of it. I remember the first time I tried to boil potatoes, they ended up just like a mash. But I learned. I learned over time. It meant that I didn't have much playtime with my other pupils at school. You know, they'd go off after school and, you know, maybe play games or go out somewhere, and I'd have to go home to look after my younger brother and sisters. But on the upside, it made me very resourceful and independent. I learned how to do lots of things from a very early age. So by the age of 9 or 10, I was cooking really nice meals. I was, you know, doing all the family washing, all those kind of things. I was born 1952, just a few years after the end of the Second World War. And when I was growing up, lots of comics, books and films had war themes. And I can remember about the age of 10 or 11, I began to ask my parents and other adults, you know, my teachers at school, why did people allow Hitler to come to power? Why didn't they stop him? And no one could give me a satisfactory answer. But I can remember from that early age saying to myself, if I ever saw tyranny and injustice, I wouldn't remain silent and do nothing. I'd stand up and make a fuss. In 1963, when I was 11, I saw reports about the racist bombing of a black church in Birmingham, Alabama, in the United States, where 4 young girls about my own age were murdered. I was horrified. I thought, how can anyone kill another human being, let alone 4 young girls in church on a Sunday morning? And that made me a lifelong anti-racist. In fact, more than that, it made me inspired by the struggle of Dr. Martin Luther King and the Black Civil Rights Movement in America. For me, they were putting Christianity into action. For them, it wasn't just pious words and prayers, it was about making true and reality the principles of the Gospels about blessed are the peacemakers, the meek shall inherit the earth, the good Samaritan, I am my brother and sister's keeper. A bit later, a few years later, my first ever campaign was against the death penalty in my hometown of Melbourne, Australia. In 1967, when I was 15, still at school like you, an alleged killer, a prisoner who'd escaped from jail, it was alleged that he'd shot dead a prison warder during the escape. And I read reports in the local paper about the autopsy on the dead warder's body, on the scenario where the shooting took place. And I worked out, as a 15-year-old, it would have been probably impossible for him to have fired the fatal shot. So, for example, let's say that the escaped prisoner was standing over there in the corner, the warder was running after him over here, the prisoner turned and fired a shot. But in the autopsy report it said the bullet entered up here and exited through the stomach. So how could a bullet fire through the air and then do a U-turn? I guess it's not impossible, but I can't imagine how it could be possible. So that made me very skeptical about this man's guilt. Plus, one of the warders said that he thought his fellow warder had been accidentally shot by one of the other police officers or warders. So anyway, I can't say, even to this day, I can't say whether that man was guilty or not. But certainly there was a reasonable doubt. So I got involved as a 15-year-old in the campaign to try and stop his execution. We did not succeed. He was hanged anyway. And that made me a lifelong skeptic of authority. I thought to myself, if they can hang a man where there's reasonable doubt that he committed this terrible crime, then I can't have confidence in the police, the courts, or the government. And quite clearly, the government of the time, which could have given clemency and commuted to life imprisonment, it was coming up to an election. And the government wanted to win this election by banging the law and order drum, that it was tough on crime. And I just thought, well, if that's what they're prepared to do, I wonder what else the government's doing that isn't abuse of power. So for the first time ever, I began to question the way in which Indigenous black Australians were treated. You know, in the cities, there were hardly any Aboriginal people. They were out in reserves and far, far away in the rural areas. So I'd actually never met an Aboriginal person. We weren't taught about Aboriginal history in school. But I began to ask and, with the help of some teachers, did some research and read some books. And I discovered just how terrible things were. When the first English people went to Australia to settle in 1788, there was an estimated somewhere between 500,000 and 750,000 Aboriginal people. It was their land. It was their country. They'd lived there for 30, 40, 50,000 years. But when the English settlers went there, they were forced out of all the verdant, abundant coastal regions and forced into the desert interior. And in the process, many of them died, either from imported European diseases or from willful killings. So many of these English people had come from parts of England, the Toffs, where they did fox hunting. Well, there weren't any foxes in Australia, so they went Aboriginal hunting. They'd ride out on horses and then shoot Aboriginals like foxes. I was never taught this at school. And I was horrified to learn that by the 1920s, the number of Aboriginal people in Australia had gone down from at least 500,000 in 1788 to about 120,000 in 1920. That was a genocide. So I began to get involved in the campaign for Aboriginal rights. And I'd read that lots of young Aboriginal kids your age left school prematurely because their parents needed their income. So they never got a proper education. So together with some other pupils at my school, we linked up with pupils at other schools all across the state of Victoria, and we decided to set up what we called an Aboriginal Educational Incentive Fund. So the idea was we would raise money to provide scholarships to Aboriginal kids so they could stay on at school, so they could get qualifications and get a good job to support themselves, their families and their communities. And we did things like sponsored long walks. I don't think until we did it, anybody had ever done it, but we dreamt up this idea of a sponsored long walk of about 11 miles along the beaches in Melbourne. And we raised a huge amount of money in those days, which began this scholarship scheme, which still exists to this day, and has helped hundreds, if not, I think probably thousands of Aboriginal kids continue their education. I also began to question Australia's involvement in the war in Vietnam. We were told this was a just war to prevent godless communism taking over Vietnam. But what we weren't told was that in 1954, the United States had intervened to stop free and fair elections because they feared the communists would win the elections. And moreover, Australia and the United States were supporting a tyrannical regime in the south of Vietnam, based in Saigon. A tyrannical regime which assassinated, imprisoned and tortured anyone who was critical of the war. I got involved in that campaign. I served briefly as an executive member of the Vietnam Moratorium Campaign. In 1970, we organised an appeal to the Australian people, stop work to stop the war. The idea was to get people to leave their place of work, to leave their homes, to leave their schools, to mass assemble in the centre of Melbourne to show the government the strength of opposition to the war. In Melbourne, which at the time had a population of only about 1 million, we had 100,000 people on the streets of Melbourne, a tenth of the entire population, including school kids, trade unionists, mums and dads, housewives, factory workers. And that was the turning point. From that moment, the government realised that public was against the war and that Australia had to move towards withdrawal. It wasn't until I was 17 that I realised I was gay. And then, of course, that became an issue for me because in those days, in the state of Victoria, if you were gay, you could be imprisoned for several years and you could be subjected to forced in psychiatric treatment. You could actually be put into a mental hospital because you were gay. So I became convinced we must do something to fight this injustice as well. But in those days, in Melbourne, Australia, there were no gay rights organisations. So all I could do was write letters to the press, to members of parliament, and to lobby. But I was all by myself. You know, I tried to interest friends, but they were too scared. So I just carried on quietly by myself. I didn't have any reference point, but I looked back to the Black Civil Rights Movement and I thought to myself, if African Americans are a persecuted minority with a claim for equal rights, then so too are LGBT people, lesbian, gay, bisexual and transgender people. They too are an oppressed minority and they too have a claim for equal rights. based on the experience of the Black Civil Rights Movement, I calculated that it would probably take about 50 years to win LGBT equality in law in countries like Australia, Britain and the United States. And coincidentally, my guesstimate was almost right. You know, it has been about 50 years since the beginning of the modern lesbian and gay liberation movement, and we now in Britain, in most respects, with a few minor exceptions, we do now have equal rights. But it took half a century. What I'd like to do now is perhaps talk a little bit about some of the specific campaigns that I've done, to give you a flavour. So, many of you will know that for many years, Robert Mugabe was the president of Zimbabwe. And although he was very homophobic, the key thing about him was that he became a dictator. Initially, he was a liberation hero. He helped free his country from white minority rule and from segregation and discrimination against black Zimbabweans. So he was a hero, and I was actually involved in the campaign to support his liberation struggle. As a student, I did fundraising efforts to raise money to buy medical kits for people living in the liberated areas of Zimbabwe. So the people that Mugabe's forces had liberated from white minority rule, I helped buy medical kits so they could provide basic medical treatment to the people living there. But certainly by the mid-1980s, he became a tyrant. And in the region of Matabeleland of Zimbabwe, in the 1980s, his forces massacred an estimated 20,000 black Africans because they supported a rival political party. So in the 1990s, or the late 1990s, I was approached by a Zimbabwean human rights activist who said, no one in the outside world seems to realize what is happening in our country. So by this time, people were being arrested and detained without trial. There was mass use of torture of political critics and opponents. The state media was censored, and so on and so on and so on. So they asked me, said, can you do something to help raise international awareness about what Robert Mugabe is doing? So I began by organising protests outside the Zimbabwean High Commission in London. And they were great, they're fabulous. They got a bit of publicity, but not much. So I thought to myself, we have to do something more challenging and provocative to get media coverage which will help raise public awareness about the human rights abuses in Zimbabwe. So I hit on the idea of using the powers of citizen's arrest. Because quite clearly governments weren't going to arrest him, but we as private citizens, we all have, in law, the right to arrest someone if we have evidence that they've committed a crime. And then of course we have to hand them over to the police. But you and I have the power of citizen's arrest. So I thought I will use the power of citizen's arrest to grab President Mugabe, hand him over to the police and put him on trial. And I chose the laws against torture as the instrument to do this. Under the United Nations Convention Against Torture in 1984 and under Britain's 1988 Criminal Justice Act, any person or state official who acts in a way that makes torture happen, who participates in torture, who condones it, who acquiesces in it, they can be arrested and put on trial. This is a crime under British and international law. And it's got a universal jurisdiction, so it applies to anyone in any country. So I thought that is a strong legal basis for President Mugabe's arrest. And I got evidence from Amnesty International about that President Mugabe had authorized the torture of 2 black journalists in Harare, the capital of Zimbabwe. So there was a legal case, very, very clear. Now, of course, the next thing was, let's try and get a government to arrest him. But no government was willing. Even though we had the evidence, we had the legal evidence that he had condoned and acquiesced in acts of torture of these 2 journalists, no government was willing to arrest him. So I thought, we've tried, I'm going to try and arrest him as a private citizen. Then, of course, the question came, when and where. Several months passed, and then in late October 1999, at just about midnight, I received a phone call at my home. Guy in a very thick African accent said, "You might be interested to know that President Mugabe has arrived in London tonight. He's on a short Christmas shopping expedition at Harrods. He's going to fly back to Zimbabwe at 6 p.m. from Heathrow Airport on Saturday night, and he's currently staying at the St James's Court Hotel near Victoria Station in London." Before I could ask any question, the caller hung up. So I thought to myself, is this a wind-up, a hoax, or maybe it's genuine? So I assumed, or made the assumption, that fingers crossed it was genuine. So the next morning, I went to Amnesty International. I got a dossier, a legal dossier, showing that President Mugabe had authorized the torture of these 2 black journalists. And then I started phoning around to people, who's going to come and help me do a citizen's arrest? I found loads of organizations. I've never heard so many plausible excuses. I'm at work, my boyfriend or girlfriend's come for the weekend, I've got the flu. Everybody had an excuse. So in the end I ran out of options, so I turned to the LGBT group Outrage. And this was not about LGBT issues, this was about torture. But, thankfully, 3 members of Outrage agreed that they would accompany me and try and arrest him. So we turned up on the Saturday morning, because we knew he was going to fly back to Zimbabwe on the Saturday night. At some point he'd have to leave the hotel to go to the airport. So we turned up really early, 8:30 in the morning, a freezing cold morning, outside his hotel. And to try and look inconspicuous, one guy stood in a phone box pretending to make phone calls, another one stood at a bus stop reading a newspaper, I was looking in shop windows, and we brought with us a photographer, a journalist, and a video person, so that we could have independent corroboration of what we were attempting to do. Anyway, we were waiting and waiting and waiting. And after about 2 hours, the concierge came out onto the steps of the hotel. The guy, concierge is like a posh guy, posh hotels. He wears a top hat and tails, and he greets guests. Anyway, he came out on the steps and began to look at us. I could see him visibly looking at us, and obviously I thought, oh, he's noticed we're here, we've been here for 2 hours, he's probably suspicious. So I began to get a bit worried, and I thought, well, he might call the police or something, but no, that didn't happen. But what did happen, about 50 minutes later, out from the side entrance of the hotel, the vehicle entrance and the entrance that leads to the VIP apartments, out came about 5 or 6 African-looking guys. And I saw them visibly pointing at each of us. Obviously, I'm assuming they'd been alerted by the concierge that we'd been there for 2 hours and the concierge was suspicious. So I thought to myself, this is bad news, because if they think we might be a potential security threat, then either Mugabe won't come out, or they will call the police and all our plans will go down the drain. But on the other hand, I also felt quite optimistic. I thought, 5 or 6 African guys, who would they be from other than, you know, a head of state or someone really important? So I sort of thought, well, perhaps Mugabe really is in the hotel. Anyway, in that situation, you're very, very nervous. You know, we'd been there, you know, over 2 hours in the freezing cold. You can see I'm quite a skinny guy. I was shivering. Plus, I was so nervous about the prospect of, will we succeed? Will we fail? Will we get arrested? Will we be beaten up? My stomach was churning over. I had a splitting headache. It's really hard in those circumstances to think clearly. But suddenly I had a brainwave. So I walked across the road to these African guys, smiling and beaming, and held out my hand to shake their hand. And of course, they saw me as somebody friendly. And I said, "Hi guys, I'm from the News of the World. And these are my fellow journalist and photographer and video person. We've had a tip-off that Elton John is staying in this hotel with his new boyfriend. and we've got to get the photos and stories for tomorrow's paper. Can you tell us which room he's in? They shook their heads. I said, I'll give you £50. I'll give you £75. I'll give you £100. I only had £10 in my pocket. But they didn't buy it. So then I had another sort of momentary brainwave. I turned to one of them, I said, you can't fool me. I know you. You are part of Elton John's security team because I saw you at his Wembley concert 2 months ago. There was no Elton John concert 2 months previous. And I said, you wouldn't be here if Elton John wasn't in this hotel. Now please, please, tell us which room he's in, and I'll give you £100. Anyway, they all burst out laughing and then walked off. And I thought to myself, maybe I've convinced them. And sure enough, about 10 or 15 minutes later, out from that vehicle entrance came President Mugabe in his limousine. I scratched the top of my head to indicate it's him in the car. My colleagues, my 3 colleagues, ran out straight in front of his speeding limousine and forced it to halt. It screeched, brakes put on, and screeched to a halt about 6 or 9 inches from their legs. Then one guy ran behind the car, so it couldn't go forward and couldn't go backward. Meanwhile, I ran from the side and opened the left rear door. Amazingly, it was unlocked. I opened the door, and there in front of me was President Mugabe of Zimbabwe. With this hand, I gently took his arm, and then held up this hand with an open palm to show I didn't have a weapon, and said, President Mugabe, you're under arrest on charges of torture. I am now summoning the police. You should have seen the look on his face. I mean, he is very dark-skinned, but you could see a visible ashen pallor across his face. And he recoiled in his seat like a frightened 10-year-old boy. His eyes popped, his jaw dropped. He held up his hands like this. And I thought to myself, now you know what your victims feel like. Only we aren't going to kill you or torture you. We're going to take you to a court of law, and you'll have a chance to defend yourself. So we then summoned the police. Initially, only 3 officers arrived, and there were 4 of us. So to remove us away from the car, it took 2 officers. So 2 officers would remove us from the car, and they put us on the pavement. Then they'd go back to get the next person. Meanwhile, the person who had been put on the pavement ran back in front of the car. So that didn't work. So I had to wait for another probably 10 minutes before reinforcements arrived, about 20 police officers. And we were totally peaceful, non-violent, but we were quite aggressively and, I would say, violently arrested. Meanwhile, President Mugabe was given a police escort to go Christmas shopping at Harrods. President of a poor country where people were starving was spending hundreds of thousands of pounds on a single shopping trip to Harrods. Anyway, we spent the next 7 hours in Belgravia police station while the police were planning to charge us with obstructing the highway, which is probably, I suppose, we did obstruct the highway, but then falsely that we assaulted the police, that we caused criminal damage to the president's limousine, and they even wanted to charge us with riot and affray, which is a very, very serious offence. In the end, on the opening day of our trial, our lawyer said to the judge, we will be presenting video evidence which records the entire incident and will show that these 15 police officers who are called to court as witnesses will be committing perjury. So the court was adjourned for a few minutes. When it reconvened, it was announced that all the charges were dropped. The upshot was we did not succeed in arresting President Mugabe. But our attempt got worldwide media coverage and highlighted the human rights abuses that we were talking about. Not just of those 2 journalists, but the massacres of the 20,000 people in Matabeleland and all the other terrible things that Mugabe's regime did. We received, I think in the weeks afterwards, about 5,000 letters or emails from people in Zimbabwe. And this is a time when the internet was not very popular in Zimbabwe, but 5,000. And they nearly all said the same thing. We thought no one knew. We thought no one cared. So the upshot was that it was a huge psychological boost for people in Zimbabwe to know that people in the outside world knew and cared about what was happening in their country, and that we at least tried to bring their president to justice. So psychologically and emotionally, it was a big upliftment for people in Zimbabwe. I'll just talk briefly about maybe another campaign which we did, which was to challenge the Church of England over the homophobia of the then Archbishop of Canterbury, Dr. George Carey. This was in 1998. Dr. Carey, after he became Archbishop, made it very, very clear that in his view, homosexuality was a terrible sin, that gay people must repent, and that moreover, even worse, that gay people were inferior to heterosexual people, and that therefore it was correct that the law should discriminate. So he said there should be no legal recognition of same-sex relationships. Employers should have a right in certain circumstances to sack a gay person from their job. That same-sex couples should not be allowed to foster or adopt children. And that, as well as that, there should be no equalisation of any laws like the age of consent. Because in those days, the age of consent for sex between men and women was 16, but between men and men it was 18. So 2 years discrimination, which criminalised young gay men aged 16 and 17. So we tried to meet the Archbishop, but he wouldn't meet us. He wouldn't even meet members of the lesbian and gay Christian movement, many of whom were members of his own Anglican church. So we thought, if he won't even have a dialogue, we have to go and challenge him. And where better than on the most important day in his calendar, Easter Sunday in Canterbury Cathedral. So we turned up very early to make sure we got good seats near the front, dressed in our Sunday best. We assembled in the side aisle, so we weren't in the main view. And we sat there and bought our Bibles and hymnals, and we just looked at our books while we waited the time. We didn't interrupt any of the sacred parts of the service, not the prayers or anything like that. We waited until Dr. Carey began his sermon. And then we calmly got up our seats and started to walk towards the pulpit. And as we got near the pulpit, we noticed there were 3 church wardens. And our plan was to go into the pulpit and take over the pulpit. And we thought, well, if we try and do that with those church wardens, there's going to be a scuffle. We don't want that. We're peaceful people. So, very cleverly, one of our members feigned an asthma attack and began gasping and even fell down on the floor. And of course, the church wardens ran over to help him. And while they did that, we walked into the pulpit. I remember walking up into the pulpit, the Archbishop was in full throw, and unexpectedly I stood beside him. Amazingly, he stood to one side and gave me the pulpit. And then I began a short alternative sermon, the basis of which was that discrimination is not a Christian value. That if you're a Christian, you cannot support discrimination against other people, including those who are LGBT or T. Being a big, big civic occasion, this service was televised around the world. All the local leaders of the community in Canterbury and Kent were there, the councillors, the council leaders, the heads of all the local community services, the councillors, plus, of course, the chief of police and some of his deputies. So I noticed that as I began talking, they got out of their seats and began to walk towards the pulpit. But I ignored them and just carried on doing my preaching. I was sort of holding on to the pulpit like this, or actually like this, actually, just to steady myself, because I was very, very nervous. And then the next thing I knew, these big meaty arms grabbed me around the waist and yanked me backwards. And I'm afraid to say that in the process, I was holding on to the pulpit. I was holding on quite tight because I was nervous. The pulpit, this beautiful, I think 13th century pulpit, came to pieces in my hands. Anyway, I was dragged up by the police and was arrested. And I was taken to Canterbury police station, spent about 6 hours in the cells, but they didn't know what to charge me with. They obviously wanted to get me, but they didn't know what to charge me with. So I was bailed, And then I had to go back to report, and I was told that you're going to be charged with, quote, indecent behaviour in a church. I didn't drop my trousers or anything, but anyway, they said indecent behaviour in a church under the Ecclesiastical Courts Jurisdiction Act of 1860, formerly part of the Brawling Act of 1551. And under this law, any interruption of a church of religion in a place of worship is, any interruption of a minister of religion in a place of worship is a criminal offence. It's a blanket law. So when it came to my trial, the magistrate accepted that I had been polite and courteous. I hadn't abused the Archbishop, I hadn't insulted the Christian religion. What I'd said was quite brief. I was well-mannered. But he said, you know, the law is the law. There's no exceptions to this law. So he said, I have to find you guilty. He could have fined me £5,000 and sent me to prison for 6 months. Instead, his sentence was a fine of £18.60. His reference to the 1860 Act under which I've been convicted. And that is, to this day, my only standing conviction, despite over 3,000 protests that I've done. I've been arrested at least 100 times. I've been violently assaulted over 300 times, but only one standing conviction. The upshot was that, again, this protest made headlines all around the world. And we made the point that for 8 years, the Archbishop had refused to meet lesbian and gay people. That's why we felt we had to go to his church. And that was incredibly embarrassing. It made the Archbishop look really, really bad. So the upshot was that very soon afterwards, he did finally agree to meet with the lesbian and gay Christian movement for the first time. And some of his fellow bishops, who claimed they weren't aware that he was advocating anti-gay discrimination law, they spoke out. They said, as Christians, we believe the law should be equal for everyone. That discrimination, as I said, is not a Christian value. Plus, on top of that, the Archbishop set up an ongoing dialogue with people in the LGBT community. So, again, positive outcomes. And certainly the Archbishop, he didn't stop his lobbying against gay equality laws, but he did dramatically reduce it. And as far as I know, I don't think he ever publicly again said anything against the LGBT community. So it did have a positive outcome. Those are just two examples, Mugabe and Dr. Carey, of the many, many, many campaigns and protests I've done over the years. I would say that, you know, the vast majority have had really positive outcomes. Perhaps not entirely exactly as I expected, but nevertheless a positive thing which wouldn't have happened without those protests. So I think the upshot of the lesson is follow your conscience, do what you believe to be right, be prepared to take the consequences, and I was prepared to take the consequences of those protests. But the important thing is be true to yourself, and that you can make a difference. Whatever field of endeavour you go on to lead in your future lives, you can make a difference. And that's really important, because only by people like you standing up and making a difference that we live in a better society. Thank you.